Imagine a room filled with the world's most seasoned critics, people who have seen every pixel since the early 90s, suddenly falling into a stunned silence. This wasn't because of a cinematic trailer or a celebrity endorsement. This was the Gamescom shockwave. When Crimson Desert first flickered onto the massive screens in Cologne, it didn't just showcase high-definition textures or impressive lighting. It felt like a direct challenge to the very foundation of modern gaming. We have grown accustomed to a certain level of excellence, but also a certain level of predictability. Crimson Desert, however, looked back at us with a ferocity that suggested the rules were about to change forever. It was a declaration of war against the stagnant status quo that has gripped the industry for the last decade. This wasn't a marketing beat. It was a tectonic shift in expectations. For years, we have lived in the era of the static open world. You know the formula. Climb a tower, reveal a map cluttered with icons, and follow a scripted path. Western SEA conglomerates have perfected this loop, turning vast landscapes into glorified checklists. This Ubisoft-style design has its charms, but it often feels like walking through a hollow museum. You can look, but you cannot truly touch. Then comes the world of Pywell. The environment is a chaotic, reactive organism. We didn't see a hero walking through a set piece. We saw Macduff colliding with a world that fought back. When he swung his sword, trees splintered and mud shifted. Every action seemed to ripple through the environment, creating a sense of presence that is rare in the medium today. At first glance, it is easy to think this is just another high-fidelity RPG. But that is where the deception lies. The graphics are actually the least interesting thing about this project. While many developers are busy chasing photorealism at the expense of depth, Pearl Abyss is doing something radical. They are building a simulation that breathes. It looks like just another high-fidelity RPG, right? Wrong. The visual fidelity is merely the bait for a much deeper hook designed to pull us into a world that remembers our presence. Industry veterans noticed the subtle anomalies in the physics engine immediately. They watched as Macduff didn't just press a button to climb, but interacted with the geometry of the world in a way that felt tactile. He swings from ropes, crashes through windows, and utilizes the environment as a weapon. This is not a canned animation. It is a physics-driven interaction where the protagonist and the world are in a constant dialogue. The way he grapples an enemy suggests a level of systemic freedom that makes even acclaimed titles look like they are running on outdated tracks. Every movement feels earned, and every collision carries weight. This leads to a burning question. How can a single studio from South Korea achieve what the largest Western conglomerates are struggling with? Pearl Abyss has pivoted with a technical precision that has left the old guard gasping. It is a David and Goliath story where David brought a proprietary engine that defies conventional logic. This shift in power highlights a growing divide between safe, iterative sequels and the bold, experimental frontiers being explored in the East. We should view Crimson Desert as a tech demonstration of our near future. It represents the transition from the static era to the reactive era. This is the moment we realize that the games we have been playing were merely blueprints for the digital realities that are arriving. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The journey into Pywell is just beginning, and what lies beneath the surface is even more complex than the stunning visuals suggest. We are standing on the precipice of a shift that will redefine our interactions. To understand the gravity of what is happening with Crimson Desert, we must first look at the lineage of its creator. Pearl Abyss did not emerge from the traditional sphere of single-player epic adventures. Their long history is deeply rooted in the complex, high-performance world of Black Desert Online. That title served as a massive public laboratory for their ambitions, pushing the boundaries of what an MMO could look like and how fluid its combat could feel. However, the constraints of the massive multiplayer genre are legendary. In that space, developers are constantly battling the limitations of server synchronization and network latency. You cannot have a world where every single tree can be felled, or every stone can be kicked, when you have thousands of players interacting with the same space simultaneously. Moving to the single-player framework of Crimson Desert allowed Pearl Abyss to finally unleash the full potential of their vision. They moved from managing digital traffic to focusing processing power on a single, cohesive experience. This shift matters because it represents a move from surface-level breadth to structural depth. At the heart of this transition lies the Black Space Engine, a proprietary masterpiece that sets Pearl Abyss apart from almost every other developer in the modern industry. While the Western LAA conglomerates have largely moved towards standardized, licensed engines like Unreal Engine 5 to mitigate risks and speed up production, The South Korean studio chose to build their own house from the ground up. When you build your own engine, you are not limited by the tools someone else designed for you. The Black Space Engine allows for a level of deep integration between artificial intelligence and physics that simply cannot be achieved with off-the-shelf software. It is the digital architecture that permits the world of Pywell to function as a unified organism. In this engine, physics are not an afterthought added to a scene. They are the very foundation upon which every interaction is built. It is this proprietary control that allows the developers to manipulate light, shadow, and matter with a precision that makes the world feel fundamentally real. This technical mastery manifests most clearly in what we can call environmental intelligence. In most games, weather is a visual layer consisting of a skybox change and particle effects. In the world of Pywell, weather is a transformative force. We see Macduff navigating through intense storms where the ground is not just a flat texture, but a dynamic surface. Terrain deformation means that as rain falls, the earth softens into mud, and as Macduff traverses this sludge, his footsteps leave deep physical indentations that affect his balance and movement speed. This isn't a scripted animation, it is a systemic response to environmental variables. If a cold front moves in, the moisture freezes, altering the friction of the terrain and forcing the player to rethink their approach to a climb or a combat encounter. Wind is not just a sound effect, it carries physical weight, pushing against Macduff's cloak and diverting the trajectory of his arrows. This level of reactivity turns the environment into an active participant in the narrative. This leads to the crucial human connection that players have been craving for years. We do not just want to play through a story, we want to inhabit a world that acknowledges our presence. This is the true meaning of agency. When Macduff interacts with a village, his actions ripple through the social and physical fabric of that place. If he destroys a gate or burns a supply wagon, those changes persist. The world remembers that he was there. This creates a powerful sense of systemic immersion, where the player feels that their choices have weight beyond a dialogue tree. The developers at Pearl Abyss approach this complexity like an alchemist. Instead of trying to hard-code every outcome, they create robust systems that interact freely. This alchemist approach represents the next great frontier in game design, where the developer shifts from director to an architect of possibilities. As we move deeper into the fabric of Pywell, the focus shifts from the cold, tactile earth beneath Macduff's boots to the breathing, thinking entities that inhabit it. For decades, open-world games have relied on the illusion of life, a thin veil of scripted routines that often vanish the moment a player looks too closely. We have all seen the digital merchant who stands behind the same wooden counter for eternity, rain or shine, never sleeping and never eating, existing only as a static node to serve the player's progress. Pearl Abyss, through the immense capabilities of their proprietary Black Space engine, is attempting to shatter this long-standing artifice. In Pywell, the inhabitants are not mere window dressing or quest markers. They are governed by sophisticated behavioral loops that prioritize their own survival, social standing, and daily needs within a living ecosystem. These characters operate on schedules that feel less like a pre-programmed loop and more like a simulated life. They react to the changing light of the sun and the shifting temperament of the weather with a logic that feels earned. If a bridge is washed out by a systemic flood, the traders don't simply vanish or walk blindly into the water. They congregate at the river's edge, they discuss the physical obstacle, and they seek alternative routes based on the internal logic of their world. But here's where it gets strange. This intelligence isn't reserved for peaceful moments in a village square. It is woven directly into the very steel of every combat encounter Macduff faces. When the protagonist draws his sword against a group of bandits, he isn't fighting a set of predictable animations or simple health bars. The artificial intelligence in Crimson Desert is designed to be reactive in a way that feels uncomfortably human. Instead of rushing headlong into your blade, enemies will actively assess the terrain for tactical advantages. If Macduff stands near a precipice, the bandits will prioritize grappling maneuvers and heavy kicks to toss him into the abyss. If he uses a specific combination of moves too frequently, the AI begins to anticipate the rhythm, parrying with increasing efficiency or backing away to force a change in tactics. This emergent combat turns every skirmish into a high-stakes puzzle where the rules are constantly changing. You might see an enemy kick a heavy table toward you to break your charge, or another grabbing a nearby torch to ignite a patch of dry grass you happen to be standing on. It is a dance of variables where the environment is used as a weapon by both sides of the conflict. This brings us to a fundamental shift in how we define immersion. To understand the ambition here, we have to look at the difference between scripted immersion and systemic immersion. Think of a masterpiece like Red Dead Redemption 2. It represents the absolute peak of scripted immersion. Every detail, from the way a horse breathes to the specific dialogue of a passerby, was meticulously handcrafted by thousands of developers to create a beautiful, perfectly tuned clockwork universe. However, it is still a clockwork. If you step outside the narrow boundaries of what the developers intended, the gears begin to show. Crimson Desert is aiming for something far more volatile and perhaps more authentic. Systemic immersion doesn't rely on a developer hand placing every single interaction. Instead, they build the rules of physics, the needs of the AI, and the physical properties of the environment, and then they let them collide. In Pile, if you burn down a granary, you aren't just seeing a scripted fire effect, you are triggering a systemic collapse of that town's food supply, which in turn alters the behavior and hostility of every NPC tied to that resource. This creates a world that feels dangerous not because of the size of the monsters, but because of its sheer unpredictability. It suggests a reality that doesn't revolve entirely around the player, but rather permits the player to exist within its pre-existing chaos. Yet this level of complexity introduces a terrifying question for the architects at Pearl Abyss. How much freedom is too much? In a medium that traditionally relies on a structured narrative to guide the player from point A to point B, a truly systemic world is a double-edged sword. If Macduff has the agency to disrupt the very foundations of the world's logic, how do you prevent the story from unraveling into a series of broken triggers and unintended consequences? The Loop of the Alchemist is a massive gamble. It assumes that the player wants more than a story. They want a world that can be broken, reshaped, and lived in. This friction between narrative structure and systemic chaos is the primary battleground of the reactive era. It is the bridge between playing a game and surviving a digital reality, where every choice is a pebble dropped into a deep, dark well, and we are only just beginning to hear the ripples. Every time the gaming community witnesses a seismic shift like the Gamescom shockwave, a shadow of skepticism inevitably follows. It is the natural immune response of a medium that has been burned by overpromises in the past. When Macduff is shown grappling with a dragon or shattering the environment in real time, the collective breath of the industry is held in a mixture of awe and disbelief. This leads us directly into the doubt phase of Crimson Desert's journey. The technical friction of providing such absolute freedom is a monumental hurdle that few have dared to leap. Can current generation hardware actually handle this level of systemic complexity without crashing into a stuttering mess? The industry veterans, who have spent decades balancing frame rates against visual fidelity, often look at the Pywell gameplay and see a looming nightmare of CPU limitations and memory leaks. They know all too well that when you give a player a world where physics are the rule rather than the exception, the number of potential calculations per second can skyrocket into the millions. A single explosion in a crowded marketplace doesn't just create a flash of light. It sends shrapnel flying, each piece having its own weight and trajectory, potentially knocking over a fruit stall, which in turn triggers a reaction from a nearby merchant, who might then decide to flee, bumping into a guard and starting a systemic riot. This cascade of events is a CPU's worst nightmare, yet it is exactly what Pearl Abyss is promising. In the halls of Western ARA conglomerates, the standard procedure for such complexity is usually to scale back, to simplify, and to return to the safety of the static era. They argue that the average console simply cannot process a world where every tree can be climbed and every building can be scorched. There is a persistent fear that the flawless trailers we've seen are merely a vertical slice, a highly polished, isolated fragment of a game that cannot possibly exist in its entirety across a 100-hour campaign. This is where the expectation of the player meets the cold, hard reality of development bottlenecks. However, Pearl Abyss has a secret weapon that many of its competitors lack: the Black Space Engine. Because they built the architecture from the ground up specifically for Macduff's journey, they aren't fighting against the generalized limitations of a third-party engine. This allows for the integration of cutting-edge global illumination and physics-based rendering techniques that feel tactile and grounded. Global illumination ensures that light doesn't just hit a surface, it bounces, carrying the color of the blood on the cold snow or the warmth of a nearby torch into the deep shadows. This isn't just about beauty. It's about visibility and spatial awareness in a reactive world. When the wind picks up in a mountain pass, the engine calculates the friction against Macduff's heavy mercenary cloak and the sway of the ancient pines simultaneously. These aren't just aesthetic choices, they are the gears of a simulation that demands a new level of optimization. Yet the most profound friction isn't technical, it's narrative. How do you tell a structured, emotional story in a world where the player can literally burn down a village or permanently alter the local ecosystem? This is the paradox of the reactive era. Traditionally, stories rely on state saving where certain events are locked until the player arrives. But if the alchemist approach allows the world to evolve independently, the story must become as fluid as the physics. If Macduff has the agency to disrupt the very foundations of the world's logic, the narrative cannot simply be a series of checkboxes. It must be a living organism. When you burn a granary, the game's narrative engine has to pivot. Perhaps the villain you were supposed to meet there now relocates to a different fortress. Or the quest giver who was meant to feed you information now views you as a common criminal. This creates a fascinating loop of consequence that most games avoid because it is terrifyingly difficult to map out. The friction here is between the author's intent and the player's whim. Surely, the skeptics argue they'll have to scale it back for the console release to maintain a coherent plot. But the visionaries at Pearl Abyss are trying to prove that the digital realities of tomorrow don't have to be static playgrounds, but can instead be living entities that challenge our very understanding of what it means to play a game. We are watching the birth of a new standard, one where the hardware is finally being asked to do more than just render a pretty picture. It's being asked to simulate the chaotic soul of a world. This collision between simulation and storytelling is setting a new benchmark that the rest of the industry can no longer afford to ignore. For years, the Western 8AA conglomerates have relied on a comfortable, if somewhat predictable, formula for open-world design. We have all experienced it. The massive, sprawling maps filled with repetitive towers to climb, endless checklists of icons to clear, and static environments that look beautiful from a distance but feel hollow the moment you try to interact with them. This is the era of open-world fatigue. A period where the sheer scale of a game world has become a burden rather than a feature. Players are tired of walking through museum-like landscapes where they can look but cannot touch. Crimson Desert stands in stark opposition to this stagnation, functioning as a wake-up call for every developer who thought that adding more landmass was the same as adding more depth. Pearl Abyss is shifting the conversation entirely. They are moving away from the bigger is better mantra and focusing on deeper is better. In the world of Pywell, interactivity is the primary marketing tool. It's a profound change in philosophy. Instead of boasting about square miles, the developers are showing us how Macduff can interact with a simple village fence, or how a localized storm can realistically alter the trajectory of a combat encounter. This isn't just about giving the player things to do, it's about giving the world things to do in response to the player. The industry veterans watching this shift are beginning to realize that the old metrics of success are becoming obsolete. The digital reality is no longer just a buzzword, it is becoming a tangible goal where the game functions more like a living simulation than a digital toy box. In a toy box, the rules are rigid and the objects are inanimate until you pick them up. In a simulation, the rules are fluid, and the objects have their own inherent logic. This shift signals a seismic reorganization of global development power. For decades, the narrative and technical pace of the gaming world was dictated by the West. However, the rise of tech-first studios in the East, led by the visionary architects at Pearl Abyss, and joined by others like Game Science or the teams behind Project Eve, is rewriting the rules. These studios are not just catching up, they are leapfrogging the established giants by prioritizing proprietary engine development and systemic depth over safe, iterative sequels. They are treating game development as a journey guided by the persona of the alchemist, blending high-fidelity visuals with complex, reactive AI systems that the Western AAA conglomerates have been hesitant to touch due to the perceived risks of such complexity. The success of Crimson Desert is proving that the global audience is hungry for this friction. They want the grit, the unpredictability, and the feeling that their presence in a game world actually matters. They want to see the mud on Macduff's boots change as he crosses a river, and they want to know that the fire they started in a forest will actually burn until the rain finally puts it out. This is the new benchmark for AAA. It is no longer enough to have a celebrity voice actor and a high-budget marketing campaign. The world itself must be the star. The world must be alive. As we watch this transition unfold, it becomes clear that we are witnessing the end of the game as a product and the beginning of the game as an experience that evolves with us. The era of the static sandbox is over, and the era of the living, breathing digital reality has finally arrived. This shift isn't just technical, it's cultural, moving the industry toward a future where we don't just play, but exist. Yet, beneath the surface of this revolution, there is a hidden transformation occurring. What no one is talking about is how this changes the cost of making every single new video game ever made. The hidden transformation in the cost of game development is perhaps the most significant ripple effect of the Gamescom shockwave for years. The escalating budgets of Western AAA conglomerates were driven by the need for more manual labor, more artists to hand place every rock, more scripters to trigger every door, and more animators to ensure every interaction felt cinematic. Crimson Desert, however, leverages the Black Space engine to shift that burden from human hands to systemic intelligence. By creating a world that understands physics and social hierarchies, Pearl Abyss has bypassed the traditional bottlenecks of production. They aren't just building a game, they are building a framework that generates content through interaction. This efficiency is the true threat to the status quo, signaling a future where smaller, tech-focused teams can outpace the traditional giants through the power of simulation. As we look toward the horizon of this reactive era, the implications for the player are profound. We are witnessing the slow death of the static world, a funeral for the icons and the invisible walls that have defined our digital experiences for decades. Pywell represents a fundamental shift in the contract between the creator and the audience. In the old world, the developer was a puppet master, and we were merely watching the strings move. In this new world, the developer is a gardener, planting the seeds of systems and then stepping back to see what blossoms when Macduff enters the clearing. This transition challenges our very definition of game logic. When the boundary between a programmed response and a natural reaction begins to blur, the player's sense of presence is magnified to an almost unsettling degree. What happens when the line between game logic and real-world logic finally disappears? This isn't just about whether Macduff can climb a tree or break a fence. It's about the emotional weight of a world that remembers your name, reacts to your scars, and adapts to your failures. If the AI systems are as robust as Pearl Abyss promises, then every action becomes a permanent mark on the digital canvas. This level of immersion will inevitably change our expectations for every game that follows. Once you have lived in a world where the wind actually pushes you, and the NPCs have lives that continue when you aren't looking, a static map will feel like a ghost town. We are being resensitized to the possibilities of the medium, moving away from the consumption of content and toward the inhabitation of a reality. This brings us to a crossroads of preference, a moment where we must decide what truly matters to us in this brave new digital landscape. As we analyze the systems the Alchemist has woven into the fabric of Pywell, we find ourselves drawn to different corners of the experience. For some, it is the visceral, emergent combat, the thrill of a sword fight where the environment is as much a weapon as the blade. For others, it is the social AI, the prospect of navigating a society where every inhabitant has a schedule, a memory, and a motive. And then there are those of us who are captivated by the environmental physics, the beauty of a world that breathes, erodes, and transforms with the weather. It is a question of value. Which of these systems do you believe will truly define the future of our digital lives? Is it the way we fight, the way we relate, or the way we exist within the elements? In the end, Crimson Desert is more than a technical marvel or a successful launch from a South Korean powerhouse. It is a window into a future that is closer than we think. The industry veterans were right to be shocked, and the skeptics were right to be wary, because what is being proposed here is a fundamental evolution of human entertainment. We aren't just looking at a new game release on a crowded calendar, we are looking at the first tentative steps toward a digital reality that functions with the complexity and consequence of our own. As the graphics become indistinguishable from sight and the AI becomes indistinguishable from thought, the game becomes more than a toy, it becomes a destination. We are standing on the precipice of a world where the screen is no longer a barrier, but a bridge. And as we cross that bridge, we may find that we are looking at the first step toward a reality we never have to leave.